Okay. Thanks everybody for joining. I want to thank everybody for joining online and also thank my terrific students here for joining us in the classroom. I'm very, very excited to share Professor Hugh White's work with everybody today. A quick reminder to those who are joining online that you can add questions and comments into the chat at any time, and we will sift through those later, and we'll bring those to the attention of Professor White. I apologize to everybody again for the temporary muting of everybody. It's a little bit draconian, I know, but we're just going to sort of try to prevent any kind of disruptions that way. And I will be able to unmute people individually at the end if you'd like to ask your questions live. I want to thank first thanks to the Intellectual Life Fund Committee for supporting the program. Also thanks to Pamela Crossan in the History Department for making this possible, as she does with so many events. I also want to thank Alan Yavor in ATI and also Michael Karp and Angela Allen. I see that our Aldi folks, Osher Lifelong Learning folks, are again logging in from Palm Desert. So I'm really excited about that new partnership with folks logging on from our satellite campus and also through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. So thank you all for joining, and thanks to the History Club for helping to coordinate that connection as well out there at Palm Desert and here on our campus. I'll try to keep this introduction as brief as possible, but Professor White has an extremely impressive resume, and I'll be sharing his faculty profile as well in the chat. You can check that out. Professor Hugh White, who's logging on from Australia today, and thank you for joining us. It's bright and early there Tuesday morning. He's Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies in the School of International Political and Strategic Studies at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, at Australian National University. His research interests include Australian strategy and defense policy, Asia Pacific security issues, global strategic affairs. His work focuses primarily on Australian strategic and defense policy, and he has served as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments, as a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald, paper of record in Australia, and as a senior advisor on the staffs of Defense Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and as a senior official in the Department of Defense, where from 1995 to 2000, he was Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence, and as the first director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI. In the 1970s, he studied philosophy at Melbourne and Oxford universities. He was the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defence White Paper, and his major publications, including the most recent one we'll hear about in a moment, include Power Shift, Australia's Future Between Washington and Beijing, to which this is a kind of sequel, and The China Choice, Why America Should Share Power, and then Without America, Australia's Future in the New Asia, and How to Defend Australia. This most recent work is titled Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America. It's a quarterly essay published in 2022. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Professor Hugh White.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to all of your colleagues who've helped to make this happen. It's a great pleasure to join you all there. What I want to do is to give you an Australian view of the US-China strategic contest, which dominates so much of our thinking today about what's happening in Asia and indeed about America's place in the world. And I want to start by just thinking about asking the most fundamental question, that is, what is this contest about? And if you look at it superficially, what we hear about most are a series of specific questions. There's the freedom of navigation issue throughout the Western Pacific, and particularly, of course, in the South China Sea. The questions of trade and China's conduct as a major trading nation and its aggressive approach to selling its stuff abroad and the way in which it uses its economic power to pressure other countries. And of course, there are very deep questions about human rights. But I'd like to put it to you that none of these things are what really drives the US-China strategic contest. I think it's something much more fundamental, much more elemental than that. it's about the respective roles of the US and China in East Asia and the Western Pacific, and more broadly about their respective roles globally. And I think the way of framing that contest is very simple. China wants to take America's place as the leading power in East Asia. That's the place America has occupied, depending on how you cut the history, but arguably for 120 something years. You might say since Manila Bay in 1899, since America took the Philippines. Throughout that period, of course, with some very strong contests from Japan and so on, America has been the primary power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And in particular, since about 1972, since Nixon's visit to China, his role in East Asia as the primary power has been uncontested by any of the region's major powers. It's always been contested by North Korea, for example, but that hasn't been, at least until recently, such a significant question. Now, I believe China wants to take America's place as the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And America wants to stop it. America wants to preserve, I'll come back to this question in a minute, but broadly speaking, America wants to preserve its position as the leading power in East Asia, the position it's occupied for so many decades. And it also wants to preserve its position as the leading power globally, which it could not sustain if it lost its position as the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, because East Asia and the Western Pacific is a region of such significance globally. It is the most dynamic, most prosperous region in the world and the greatest concentration of power. Now, this contest between America and Asia is, of course, enormously significant for Asia. The US-led order that, as I say, initiated 120 something years ago, but and very clearly since 1972, since Nixon's visit to China, has been uncontested. That has it's no exaggeration to say that has made Asia what it is today. It's created modern East Asia, and the extraordinary dynamism of the region, the prosperity based so much in so many countries, based on astonishing economic growth driven by trade and manufactures. None of that could have happened, I think you can argue, without the kind of primacy that the US has been able to exercise and the peace and stability that's brought to the region. I'd also make the point that it's a very big issue for Australia, because not only has Australia been a beneficiary of that broader prosperity in East Asia, which has been underpinned by US primacy, but Australia is in a special position because as, if you like, an alien intrusion into the world of the Western Pacific, as an essentially European origin society, much less European now than it was, but still essentially a European origin society transplanted into the Western Pacific. The presence here of this country on this continent, in this part of the world, is very much been a product of the maintenance over the century since first European settlement here in 1788, of the domination first of Britain, then of America, in this part of the world. That ever since Australia was settled by Europeans in 1788, the preponderant maritime power in East Asia and the Western Pacific has been either Britain or America, English-speaking countries. And Australia has therefore always framed its approach to the region in which it lives on the basis of relying on and trying to do what it can to help preserve the primacy of our English-speaking great and powerful friends, is a famous phrase often used in Australia. First Britain, then America, as the foundation for the way in which we approach our place in the region and our place in the world. And so for China to pose the kind of challenge it poses today to the position that America has occupied in Asia for so long is challenging something which in Australia's case goes right back to the very origins of the society that was transplanted here with European settlement. Because for the first time we face the prospect of trying to live in an Asia which is no longer dominated by the United States if China's challenge succeeds. And that challenge is bigger and more fundamental than the previous challenge, the challenge posed by Japan, Imperial Japan in the decades, roughly speaking, between 1930 and 1945, because China's more powerful. The other point that's significant from Australia's point of view, as for other countries in the region, is, of course, that China is enormously important to us. Just to take one dimension, China is by far our biggest trading partner. And not just our biggest trading partner today, but it remains the primary source of future economic opportunities for Australia's economy in the future. It's also a very big source of immigrants. Australia is a big immigration country, but there are well over 1 million, from a population of 25 million, there are well over 1 million Australians of Chinese extraction. And China is today, along with India, our biggest source of immigrants, and Australia remains a very big immigration country. So China is extremely important to us. And so the great question that Australia faces, as we've seen US-China rivalry escalate, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, is how far do we go to support the United States as it responds to China's challenge, as it pushes back against China? And conversely, how far do we accommodate China rather than supporting the United States? Well, the argument I've made in the essay that Jeremy mentioned is that what Australia has to, and in fact in a series of essays that I've written on this subject, is we have to first ask ourselves, well, is America going to succeed? Is America going to be successful in sustaining US primacy in the face of China's challenge? Because there's not much doubt in Australia, and certainly not much doubt, as far as I'm concerned, that if we were confident that America could succeed at relatively low cost and risk, then the arguments in favour of Australia supporting the United States would be very strong, because US primacy, for the reasons I've sketched, have been extremely successful for Australia. So will America succeed? Well, first question to ask is, what exactly is America's objective? Because there are two possibilities here. One is that what the United States seeks to do is not to preserve primacy, to preserve the predominant position it's exercised for the last 100 or something years, and certainly for the last 50 since 1972, but rather to balance China, to remain a strong player in Asia, not to dominate and lead, but to balance China as a kind of a co-equal power. And sometimes in some strands of US policy discussion, for example, in an article that was published by 2 senior members of the Biden administration just before the Biden administration was inaugurated, Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan published an article in Foreign Affairs in which they said pretty much in these words that America's aim should be to balance China rather than to continue to dominate. And I think that's an interesting thought. We'll come back to it. But my take is that really that idea has no traction in Washington and very little traction more broadly in America. That the default position for the United States is that it seeks to preserve primacy, to preserve leadership. And one way of thinking about that is to recognize that if America was going to move from primacy to balancing, it would have to be willing to treat China as an equal, and really treat China as an equal in almost every dimension of its national life. And that, I think, is something that, for reasons I quite understand, Americans find very hard to comprehend. So I think the starting point for our analysis needs to be that America's objective is to try and defeat China's challenge and preserve its primacy rather than to move to some new kind of order. And it's completely understandable why the United States should want to do that. But of course, if you look at the statements, if you look at the attitudes towards China across Congress, for example, and statements of successive administrations, it's clear that there's a strong bipartisan support for that idea. And one of the few sort of broad policy directions that survive from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, and is likely to survive into the next administration, whoever they might be. But the question is not whether that's what America wants. The question is, how much does it want it? And in particular, what price is it prepared to pay to do it? And so it's a matter of balancing the costs to the United States of achieving that objective of preserving primacy against the imperatives for it to do so. How much does America need to do it? And is it worth the cost that it would impose? And I think to answer that question, we have to go back and look at, well, what are the costs to the United States of successfully contesting China's challenge and preserving the old order in Asia? And that really is a question of power. Now, after 1989 in particular, at the end of the Cold War, when America rethought its place in the world in the radically new circumstances that emerged with the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on, the premise of America's acceptance, embrace, I should say, of a role of global leadership and continued leadership in Asia was that this was going to be pretty cheap and easy to do. It was going to be cheap because America was expected to enjoy an overwhelming preponderance in every dimension of national power: economic, technological, military, diplomatic, ideological, and so on. And it was going to be cheap also because not just did America enjoy a preponderance of power, but it also enjoyed, if you might call it, a preponderance of ideals. That is, that the values that America stood for, the big political ideas of market economics and liberal democracy, were something that it was believed that every other major power, at least around the world, including China, shared and would increasingly share as time went by. Now, those two assumptions, had they been true, would have meant that America could have preserved its position as a leading power in East Asia without much effort. But they have proved to be wrong. The big story of the last few decades has been the way in which America has not, as expected, remained the preponderant power economically and in every other way. The shift in the distribution of wealth and power as China has grown, and for that matter as other countries, has been a really fundamental change in the way Asia works. And so today we see in Asia a China challenging the United States from a power base which is much, much, much bigger than people expected. And that power is expressed both in the scale of its economy, in the scale and capability of its military, and partly because of those first two things, in the weight of Chinese diplomacy. Chinese diplomacy is not flawless. They make mistakes like every other country does, but one should not underestimate how much diplomatic weight China's economic and military power give it. And that's especially true because the contest we're talking about is, I think, primarily military. This comes as a bit of a surprise, I think, to people. But I think it's one of the things we've learned in Ukraine, one of the reasons why the Russian invasion of Ukraine was such a shock, was that it drew attention to the fact that in that other theatre, where America is also facing a contest from a great power rival, over whether Russia will be able to carve for itself a sphere of influence in its own near abroad. In that region, it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine reminded everyone of the central role of armed force in the kind of elemental power political contests that we're seeing playing out in Asia. Now, that's not to say that war is inevitable. There's a lot of argument around, my old friend and colleague John Mearsheimer is at the forefront of this debate, that when great powers compete, when a rising power contests an established leading power, war is inevitable. Now, Graham Allison has shown that it's not inevitable. There are examples in history where it hasn't happened. But it does show that it's quite likely. And it does show that even in the cases where war doesn't happen, the possibility of war, the potential for war, and the approach that the competitors take to that possibility is fundamental in resolving the way the crisis unfolds, the contest unfolds. And when we think about that in relation to East Asia, and this is central to the question as to what it's going to cost America to succeed in its contest with China, when we think about this in East Asia, what we focus on, of course, is Taiwan, and I think that's right. Taiwan is the issue which I believe will be the primary test for whether the United States can sustain its position in East Asia. And it's important to recognize that if the US and China, to the extent the US and China disagree over Taiwan, and if they are eventually drawn into a conflict over Taiwan, it won't be about Taiwan primarily. It will be about their respective roles in East Asia. Taiwan has become, if you like, the symbol of that. And just unpack that thought a bit. What China wants as it approaches the Taiwan problem, of course, it wants to take Taiwan, as it would say, take Taiwan back. It wants to reunify with Taiwan because of Taiwan's own significance. But I think it's also very focused on Taiwan's place as the symbol as to which of the two powers is the primary power in East Asia. China doesn't want a war with the United States over Taiwan. What it wants is a test of resolve between the US and China over Taiwan, which China wins and the US fails. The ideal outcome for Xi Jinping is a situation in which he threatens to use force against Taiwan. The United States is faced with the choice as to whether it really is prepared to go to war with China over Taiwan and decides on balance that it isn't. Because if that happens, then the credibility of America's position in East Asia, the confidence of its allies and so on will be very fundamentally undermined. Now, in order to prevent the Chinese doing that, the Chinese must be convinced that America will fight, that if America's resolve is tested, it won't back off. But the credibility of America's deterrent position against China, which is what we're really talking about, has eroded very sharply for a long time. If you go back to the last really major Taiwan crisis of 1996, America's capacity to defeat China in a war over Taiwan was really without question, because America's maritime capability was so overwhelmingly preponderant. But since then, China has put in a huge effort, and the United States has allowed the maritime military balance between themselves and China to deteriorate very strongly, rather to move very strongly in China's direction. And I frankly see no sign of a change in this. For all the talk about America's resolve to push back against China, we have seen no substantial steps to improve America's military position vis-a-vis China. And that means that the less likely it is, the less obvious it is to China that America believes that it can win a war with China over Taiwan, the less likely the Chinese are to believe the Americans will be willing to fight it. It is very hard to persuade someone you're prepared to fight a war that you're not expecting to win. And, for example, the war games in Washington are very pessimistic about this. And if America can't win a conventional war against China over Taiwan, then it will find itself pushed towards thinking about using nuclear weapons. I actually think the temptation for both sides to use nuclear weapons in that war is higher than a lot of other people do. I won't go into that now. But it does mean that the United States could not decide to fight for Taiwan unless it was willing to accept the risk, at least, and perhaps a very high risk, that would degenerate into or escalate into a nuclear conflict in which US cities could be targeted. And that really brings us to the key question. Can America convince China that it's willing to fight a nuclear war to defend its leadership in Asia, the way it used during the Cold War to persuade the Soviet Union that it was willing to fight a nuclear war to preserve its position in Europe? And so it is, people sometimes talk about what's happening between the US and China as a new Cold War. That's right, actually, at least in this respect. There are important differences, but there's this similarity. The big question at the heart of it is how resolved is America to preserve its position in East Asia? And in particular, is it willing to fight a nuclear war, and can it persuade China that it's willing to fight a nuclear war in order to do so? Well, that brings us to the question of imperative. As I said before, it's a matter of the cost on one hand and the imperative on the other. If the cost is the willingness to contemplate fighting a nuclear war in which US cities might be targeted, the imperative is, well, why is what's happening in East Asia so important to the United States that it should be willing to do that? And that, really raises the question, what happens if China does succeed in dominating East Asia and taking America's place? One view that's quite common is that that will lead more or less inexorably to a global hegemony, either of China or of a sort of a coalition between China and Russia and perhaps other authoritarian states. Now, I think that is a very unlikely outcome. Not necessarily because that's not what the Chinese would like. I'm not sure whether the Chinese would, how seriously the Chinese contemplate that or not. It's because the China, although it's very powerful, is not going to be powerful enough to dominate the world. In fact, it's not even going to be powerful to dominate Asia, because China is not the only rising great power in Asia. There's India as well, and also potentially Indonesia, I might say. And if you look more broadly, America is not going anywhere. America is going to remain an extraordinarily powerful country. There's Europe, which partly thanks to Donald Trump and partly thanks to Vladimir Putin, is rediscovering its own identity as a strategic player. And so I think, we're going to end up with a world in which there are a number of great powers: America, Russia, Europe, India, as well as China. China's capacity to dominate all of those, I think, is very low. So the alternative to preserving the US-led order in Asia, in East Asia, and globally, is not Chinese hegemony over the globe, and not, which would perhaps arguably threaten the United States itself. It's a multipolar order in which the United States is going to be able to defend its own interests, I think, very easily. This would not be as good as the post-Cold War order, not as good as the idea of a US-led global order and a US-led order in Asia. That order has been very good indeed. But a multipolar order like that will be better than a nuclear war. And it would not be worth fighting a nuclear war in order to prevent it. Now, I have a feeling that in a kind of way, that's the thought that underlies the new isolationism that we see in the United States, reflected in Donald Trump. I think US policy more broadly, and the policy of the Biden administration, continues to be based on the illusion that America can defeat China and preserve its position in Asia and globally without paying much more cost than it expected to pay at the end of the Cold War, spending 3 or 4% of GDP on defense rather than 6 or 8%, for example, and without risking serious nuclear war. And I think that's an illusion. Now let's just come back to Asia for a bit, because one argument that people make is that, well, America doesn't have to face this question alone. It's got all these allies in Asia who are just as worried about China as they are, and they will back the United States and help it to confront China. I want to cast some doubt on that. If you look at the Southeast Asians in particular, no Southeast Asian country is enthusiastic or even reluctant, but willing to sign up with the United States for a Cold War against China. It's very clear. They would support the United States to stay in Asia to balance, but not if that meant gang up against China in order to do so. That's, I think, equally true in different ways of India. A lot of weight has been put on India's potential role as a counterbalance to China, and that's really what the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific is all about, and it's the concept of what the Quad is all about. I'm very skeptical about that. India's role in Asia in the future is not as a counterbalance to China on behalf of American power. It sees itself as a great power in its own right that seeks to establish its own sphere of influence in its own region, in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And I think India is very unlikely to be willing to commit itself to support the United States in preventing China taking America's place in East Asia and the Western Pacific as long as China more or less leaves India alone in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And then there's countries like Japan and Australia, who are the most explicit and enthusiastic in supporting the United States against China. But I think there's a lot less to that support than meets the eye. If we look at Japan, for example, there's been a lot of talk about the way in which Japan has talked about increasing its defense spending from 1% to 2% of GDP. That looks like a big deal. It's a doubling. But actually, it leaves Japan still way short of its strategic potential to provide the sort of support that America would need if Japan's support was going to make any difference to the fundamental military balance between the US and China, and therefore America's capacity to deter a Chinese challenge. And the same is true of Australia. There's been a great deal of talk about AUKUS, for example, but AUKUS is going to deliver nuclear-powered submarines, if ever, and I personally don't think it will succeed, if ever, decades and decades from now. As a response to the challenge of China today, there's very little going on. All of that makes me very doubtful that that America is going, on balance, over the longer term, to marshal the effort required to successfully compete with China and to preserve its position as a leading power in East Asia, even though I'd very much like that it would do that. So let me just finish by saying a few things about what that means for Australia. This is the rise of China, and China's challenge to American leadership is arguably the most fundamental shift in Australia's international circumstances since European settlement. And nonetheless, both sides of Australian politics are very strongly committed to the idea that what we should be doing is supporting the United States. And AUKUS is very much the symbol of that. I think that's the wrong approach. It's not because I wouldn't like America to remain the primary power in East Asia. Ideally, dearly would. That would be by far the best outcome for Australia. I just don't think it's going to work because the costs are too high, particularly relative to the imperatives that drive the United States. The United States can live a very comfortable, secure life as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere and as a co-equal player in a multipolar global order with other countries. This was, after all, the vision of international order that was created at the end of the Second World War. The world created at the end of the Second World War was fundamentally multipolar. That's what the UN was all about. And so for Australia, I think there are, 6 things we should be doing. First of all, we have to accept the underlying reality of the power shift, the shift in the distribution of wealth and power to China and India, which is the greatest international story of our time. Secondly, we should recognize that what that means in Asia is that there will be a new order in Asia, which is not based on US leadership. Third point is that whilst we should hope that the US nonetheless continues to play the biggest role possible in East Asia, we should recognize that that is not the most likely outcome. And indeed, I think it's a quite unlikely outcome. The most likely outcome of this transformation of the Asian order is that the United States ceases to play any significant strategic role in this part of the world. And Australia needs to understand that. The fourth thing is that Australia needs to help shape what that new order looks like. And it's really, I think, a new order which is already emerging. And that is an order which is going to be, in Asia as a whole, going to reflect the preponderant position of 2 Asian great powers, China and India, in their respective spheres of influence, and may feature a 3rd Asian great power in Indonesia, which will, after all, well before the middle of the century, be the 4th biggest economy in the world, a fact which we just all tend to overlook. The 5th is that whatever else we do, we shouldn't encourage the United States to fight a war with China over Taiwan that it can't win. And I think some elements of Australian policy at the moment are doing that. And finally, Australia needs to prepare to make our way in a new Asia of the sort that I've described, which will be a very different kind of trying to put very different demands on Australian diplomacy and on Australian defence policy, and really on the way we think of ourselves, the kind of country we see ourselves as being, our identity. That's a very new situation for Australia and very challenging, but I don't think we've got much choice. I'll end there.
Thank you, please. I told my students this would be a bracing conversation. I think that's bracing. I think this is so important. I don't know if I mentioned to you, Hugh, I out of character a little bit for us historians. I spent a little bit of time with a Washington with the Wilson Center last year. I found myself in that work. Really, some really nice people, but I think also some people who really need to hear this kind of perspective. It's such an urgent and really substantial conversation, and yet it seems to be one that Americans have a really hard time coming to grips with in any serious way. So it's a real delight for me to share this with my students and with those folks who are joining online. I'm kind of vamping here a little bit if anybody has any questions. I have a lot that I'd like to talk about. Last week we had Shelley Rigger tell us a little bit about Taiwan. We talked a little bit about what's going on there, and from a real sort of perspective of Taiwan. And as you pointed out, that's in many ways at the center of this conversation. The keywords that as I read through the essay a couple of times, the keywords that stood out for me were primacy and what that means, what U.S. primacy means in a sort of concrete way, credibility, and resolve, and in a really concrete way, what we mean when we say resolve. And I think that came through again in very stark terms. I was watching my students as I do. They don't really notice that I'm watching them. A lot of eyebrows kind of going up, and some audible gasps, that I was muted here just in case for any audio here, but really some sort of cinematic kind of gasps coming from everybody to kind of hear this. I really think it's so important. And I might have mentioned my partner, my wife was born in Mackay and grew up in Sydney, and so I also feel a proximity, a closeness to this. But I also just for our students, I think getting past the Washington, Beijing perspective can also be done just because we're here in California. And I think that's kind of interesting as well, thinking in regional terms, whether it's thinking about North Korea or thinking about Beijing or Australia. Being here in California or in a place like Hawaii, also changes the way that we think about some of these things, maybe from our friends over in DC. So I think that Professor White gave us a lot to talk about. I don't see any hands here yet, but I know, there we go. Professor Yagubian, David, please go ahead and jump in.
Okay, thank you. I'm unmuted. Dr. White, thank you so much for your talk and for sharing your article with us. I found the article fascinating, and I've been looking forward to asking you this series of interrelated questions, which I'll make as brief as possible. But if you could touch on them both, I would be grateful. So I'm gonna kind of interlace these two questions, and likely your response might not take as long as it takes me to pose these questions, but I'd really appreciate your weighing in on them. So at the Center for Independent Studies 2019 China debate featuring yourself and John Mearsheimer, which has gone viral. I saw it at the time. Mearsheimer seemed to elicit nervous laughter from the audience as he explained that the security competition with China was a zero-sum game for the United States, where Australia was either going to be, quote, with us or against us. And he animatedly asserted that Australia and Australians should not want to, quote, underestimate how nasty we can be. So the first part of the question is, to what extent, to the extent that you might agree with Mearsheimer on this specific point, should Australia seek to pursue a neutral position, what lengths do you believe the United States would go to shape Australia's foreign and economic policies? To paraphrase Mearsheimer, how nasty do you think the US will get? Is the Prime Minister Whitlam experience relevant to this question? And then this relates to the second question, because of course that was in 2019. That was 4.5 years ago. I was pretty blown away to see how long ago it was. You've done several other CIS talks. And so That relates to this second part of the question. Since the enlightening exchange between you and John Mearsheimer in 2019, U.S. soft and hard power have been continually diminished by events, including but not limited to the U.S. domestic and international COVID response, the 2020 election fiasco, the haphazard pullout from Afghanistan, the failure to return to the JCPOA, the Ukraine war, the war on Gaza, and the related strikes on Yemen. And that's just a short list. Meanwhile, China has worked to advance peace in the Persian Gulf and to extend its Eurasian and global economic connections via institutions and initiatives such as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the One Belt, One Road initiative. Arguably, China's soft and hard power are growing while that of the United States is cratering rapidly. How, if at all, do these dynamics factor into the Australian dialogue regarding how to proceed between China as a growing regional hegemon and the United States as a declining global hegemon? Does China's status as a regional Asian hegemon necessarily need to be perceived as a problem for Australia, irrespective of what the US might argue or threaten to pursue its own hegemonic interests? So in short, how nasty do you think the United States will get, to paraphrase Mearsheimer, should Australia choose to pursue its own interests and its own path? And then second, in light of the last 4.5 years of developments, if you will, in US foreign policy, do you think Mearsheimer would be making those assertions with the same animated bravado that he did in 2019? Thank you so much.
Really good question, David, if I may. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed that session with Mearsheimer. Look, in answer to the last part of your question, knowing John a bit as I do, I'm sure he would still make the same things with same points with as much animation as ever. But look, let me go back a couple of steps. One of the striking things to me about that conversation that you mentioned that I had with Mearsheimer was how confident he was that America was absolutely committed to its contest with China, and that it would bear any burden and pay any price, do whatever it took, and the corollary was that it would be prepared to lean really hard, to be nasty to allies like Australia in order to pull them into line. And I disagree with John about that for the reasons that I sketched in my remarks. And that is that I don't think in the end, if you look at not at what US leaders say, but at what they do, I in fact think America's not prepared to do very much. And the good news for Australia is I don't think it's prepared to be all that nasty to us. And in fact, you could say that it's been surprisingly gentle with us so far. Australia is still spending about 2% of GDP on defence. Now, if America was really serious about mobilising Australia in a new Cold War with China, then I think it would be pushing us a lot harder than it is to do a lot more than we're doing. And I think in some ways, Mearsheimer was kind of trying to frighten Australians into getting into line, but I don't think he has the backing of Washington in doing it. The rhetoric isn't matched by action. The second point is, your question about how has US power versus China power, how's that shifted across, as you mentioned, across the spectrum of different kinds of power? And I think the answer is absolutely, and in a lot of very complex ways. But right at the heart of it seems, and I take a rather sort of what you might call fundamentalist view of this. I do think that although national power can be manifested and exercised in all kinds of different ways, right at the heart of it is economic weight. And I think the really striking thing about the contest between America and China today is that for the first time since America emerged as a global player in the late 19th century, it confronts a strategic rival with an economy which is, on the most relevant measure, I think, PPP terms, as big as the United States. And, for people of my generation, I suspect our generation, that remains almost kind of unbelievable. The idea that America had the biggest economy in the world by far, it was sort of seemed part of the axioms of of the geometry of national power, and it turns out not to be true. And from that flows all sorts of other things. So I think, just to touch on some of the things you mentioned, I do think the untidy withdrawal from Afghanistan and what went before that, the failure of the war on terror more broadly, undermined America's both power and credibility. It demonstrated the limits of American military power. It had also demonstrated what we might call the limits of American strategic judgment. And, you know, for allies, that really counts for something. You want to believe that when the leader says, you know, tells you this is where we're going to go, he's pointing you in the right direction. And I think that did a lot of damage. I think Ukraine also has been very significant, and in two ways. The first is that it's reminded people that needed reminding that America faces fundamental strategic challenges, not in just one part of the world, in Asia. The sort of idea of the pivot back in 2011 was that America could turn away from the other parts of the world because Asia was the big story. And there are still people in Washington who argue that. Aldrich Colby, for example, argues that with great clarity and vigor, as he does. But in fact, America faces really fundamental challenges to that concept of itself in global leadership in Europe, and of course, in different ways in the Middle East. And I think, you know, Ukraine has turned out to be a very complex and important demonstration of that, because at first it reminded people that America's can't just focus on Asia, it's got to focus on Europe as well. It reminded people that when you're dealing with this sort of contest between great powers over their place in the international setting, war is a real possibility. And it also reminded people of the limitations of what America was prepared to do, even before the invasion. In fact, months before the invasion, when the Russian buildup was first being detected in November and December 2021, Joe Biden came out and said, we are not going to go to war. No US troops are going to be involved in this. And that was, I don't think that was the wrong statement, but it was a very significant statement for him to make. He said, we're not prepared to fight World War III. Well, if you're not prepared to fight World War III over Ukraine, why are you prepared to fight World War III over Taiwan? Why is Taiwan more important to the United States than Ukraine? And the third point about Ukraine is that, you know, in the first months of the war, where Russia did so badly and Ukraine did so well, it was very tempting for everyone to think, oh, this is a triumph for the United States. You know, people were writing this. It's mobilized a global coalition to oppose Russia and support Ukraine. The Ukrainians are going to defeat Russia for us. We won't have to fight them. We just have to send them some money and some weapons, and they'll do the fighting for us. The Russians will be defeated and humiliated, and that'll be the end of that problem. And we now know that's not true. I never thought that was going to be true, but, you know, it's a very complicated process. And the idea that this is going to end up as a simple win for Ukraine and America and the West and a defeat for Russia, it's not going to be that simple. So I think all of that is very significant, both in emboldening China and in undermining confidence elsewhere. You know, if you were sitting in Singapore or Jakarta or Seoul or New Delhi or in Canberra, and you asked, you know, how's this looking? It don't look good. And of course, I haven't even mentioned Donald Trump. Now, you know, one could spend all my morning or afternoon talking about Donald Trump, but he, you know, I do think, well, I think that the way Trump represents a turn towards what one might crudely call isolationism, though I don't like that word, because I think it carries pejorative connotations that shouldn't, but a redefinition of America's interests away from exerting global leadership. I think that Trump is obviously a very potent advocate of that, and his persistence in the center of US politics is a demonstration that that idea has real appeal, but I think it goes deeper and more broadly than that. So, you know, the short answer to your second question is yes. You know, America has lost, and China has done well. People, for example, criticized China's economic diplomacy, saying that it makes countries debt, puts people in sort of debt traps and so on. They've criticized its wolf warrior diplomacy, saying that it's alienated people. Actually, no, that's wishful thinking on our part. The countries of Southeast Asia are not swinging to America's side. The South Koreans even, although, varies a bit from who's in the Blue House, but South Koreans' attitude is much more complex. India's attitude is much more complex. The Chinese are not bad at this stuff. So I think, now the last point is, bring this back to Australia. What does it mean for Australia to live in an Asia under China's leadership, if that's what we end up, or in East Asia under China's leadership? I mean, the first point to make is we don't know. We've never been in this situation before. And we partly don't know because we don't know what kind of a hegemon China would be. Hegemons come in different shapes and sizes. The example I use with my students is I say, let's arrange hegemons on a spectrum between Joseph Stalin and Monroe. The sort of Monroe Doctrine model over which America has exercised hegemony over the Western Hemisphere, well, at least claimed it since 1824, is, although I might not say this if I was Mexican or Venezuelan, it's pretty soft and benign. You basically let people get on with their own business and only intervene if really vital American interests seem to be at stake. Whereas Stalin, very, very intrusive, commissars in every ministry sort of stuff. I think China is much more likely to be more at the Monroe Doctrine end of the spectrum, partly because it's smarter, it costs you less. And I think Australia could live in that kind of world, could live in that kind of region, particularly because Australia, along with our neighbours, is in the comfortable position of being not just squarely in China's sphere of influence in that model, but on the boundary between China's sphere of influence and India's. Now, being on a boundary like that is a bit scary, but it also has advantages. You can play them off against one another. For us, the really interesting question is because what loom larger for any of us is what Indonesia will mean for us. Australians, like everybody else, find it very hard to imagine Indonesia conducting itself as a great power. I think Indonesians do too. But a country that's got the fourth biggest economy in the world is going to do something with it. It's not just going to continue to be to pretend it's a middle power, even a small power. But this is a big debate in Australia. I spend a lot of time saying to people, we can learn to live in an Asia which is no longer dominated by outside Anglo-Saxon English-speaking powers like England and America, which is dominated by Asian powers, but it's going to be very different. And, my case, my ancestors chose to migrate here. That's the price, We've had a good time. We've built a very successful society. Now we have to work out how to keep making it work. Sorry, it was a long answer to your question, but it was a very good pair of questions.
Deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Really, thank you. Thanks for the question, David, and Professor White for the reply. Bracing and more bracing. That is we started bracing and then we got bracinger with that. It's really tough. I see Jared has a question. I wanted to quickly jump in with one question. That is the difference in terms of the more isolationist side of the American political spectrum. And that is, of course, with the sort of standard bearer of Trump, but then also with figures in Congress and others. I'm not sure how much they have their ducks in a row in terms of message discipline and what they really think. There's some, I want to be very frank. I think there's a great deal of racism within that side. And I don't simply mean that they're ignorant, but simply in the fact that we do perceive a lot of racism from that side. And for that reason, I wonder if the perception of China as a threat and the perception of Russia as a threat is different. And I'm not sure if this is too much of a question about inside baseball on the American side of things, but in terms of the perception or the lack of urgency on the part of some right-wing American Republicans about Russia, and there's a kind of affection for the anti-woke Putin, that he's playing our same game over there, as opposed to their quite histrionic alarmism about a rising China, which is different. And just as I was thinking about this, I saw a kind of echo to World War II as well, because it wasn't German invasion that caused the US to intervene. It was the bombing of Pearl Harbor that caused the US to intervene. So and there's John Dower's terrific book about World War II being a race war.
Yeah.
Is that a factor? Different views in terms of the isolationist calculus of a Russian expansion into Europe or increasing influence, as opposed to a non-white, non-Anglo, non-white, non-Caucasian, literally, power in Asia. Is that a factor in your view of this?
Look, it's a really interesting question, Jeremy, and I'm not sure, but I simply make this observation that it's been extremely hard for people, including elites, including very sophisticated elites, I think both in America and Australia and elsewhere in the West, to really take seriously the phenomenon of China's rise. And I do think that, I've been arguing backwards and forwards on this for decades now, and until very recently, and even still today, you can see it in the sort of peak China argument that we've seen in the last few months. People find it really hard to recognize that something really big has happened, and that is that China has become the world's biggest economy. And it is a fact that for 200 years, to be wealthy and strong has meant to be white. And, Japan was the sort of only exception to that. And, I was thinking of John Dower's book exactly as you were framing your question, because, I do think that the anxiety about China has a different edge to it. And I think we'd be unwise not to recognize that there might be a racial element to that. I mean, the point I make to people is that as we look at China today, we have to look at ourselves and think very carefully about how we respond. When the Qing dynasty mandarins first encountered the phenomenon of post-industrial revolution Western power in the form of British and American power coming into East Asia in the early 19th century, they tended to dismiss it. They, was famous, response to the McCartney embassy and all that sort of thing. Whatever trinkets you guys are producing, we don't need them. We've got everything we need, go away. And, I've sometimes thought as I've, labored away, including in some very eminent US institutions, having debates with people who told me that the Chinese economy really wasn't as big as it was made out to be, and the Chinese economy could never overtake America's, and besides, that their technology would always be so far behind America's and so on. I thought to myself, there's danger that we're making the same mistake here. We look at China and we don't recognize its power because it doesn't look like us. And we're wrong. And, the history of China in the 19th century is a history of China, and most of the 20th century is a history of China suffering from that mistake. So I do think that racial thing is a part of it. I also think, though, that and conversely, I think, it is possible to slot Putin into some aspects, and because Putin actually injects himself into what you might call Western and American political conversations, things like wokeness and all of this sort of stuff, where Xi Jinping just doesn't, he just doesn't talk like that. He doesn't intrude into that kind of conversation. And so I think it's easier for those elements of the US political spectrum who are so inclined to do so to kind of colonize Putin in a way that you can't colonize Xi Jinping.
Thanks for that. And maybe it would be wise I've got some friends, some Chinese friends who say, this political correctness in America gone wild. So I think there may be an appetite in China to play into that a little bit. But the sort of Han chauvinism can definitely settle on it. But Jaron, you had a question, and I don't want to keep Professor White too much longer below the bottom of the hour, but please go ahead, Jaron.
Good morning, Dr. White. Hope you're having a good day. So you talked about the U.S. not sort of willing to fight a war with China, and how they're more likely to not fight a war that they would lose. do you think that they have the ability to not fight that war? Because by not fighting that war, they're giving away so much of their political power outside of the Western Hemisphere, and that would sort of be the death of, you know, the great United States empire that has ruled over the world for the last 50 years. Are they willing to back down and, you know, say, well, we'll let other people sit with us?
Yeah. Yeah, look, it is, I mean, it's the great question. And and just to be crystal clear, although I think there's a real danger that the Chinese will conclude that America won't fight because it can't win, I also think there's a real danger that the Chinese will end up being wrong, and that whoever's in the Situation Room in the White House at 3 o'clock in the morning, because these things always happen at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the balloon goes up, will actually reach the opposite conclusion, and precisely for the reasons you say. I mean, you can imagine the conversation around the table in the Situation Room. You know, the president turns up there and said, "What's going on?" They say the Chinese have made, you know, his advisors say the Chinese have made a military move against Taiwan. And he asks his advisors, "What do we have to do?" And some people around the table might say, "Well, Mr. President, it's all very difficult because we can't win this war and it could easily go nuclear." And you know, I'm sure if it was a sensible president, don't take that for granted, but if it was a sensible president, actually like Joe Biden, I think I'm not one of his great fans, but I think he's a reasonably sensible guy, he'd pay attention to that argument. But then he'd also hear on the other side people saying, "Yes, but Mr. President, if we don't fight for Taiwan, then our position in the Western Pacific collapses, and if our position in the Western Pacific collapses, our global leadership collapses." I mean, it's just exactly the argument that you just sketched, and I can easily believe that an American president would find themselves feeling at that point that they had no choice. And particularly because, you know, it's possible to imagine, and, you know, one doesn't want to scenarioize this in too much detail, but it's possible to imagine that the way the conversation would go would be that the president would say, you know, "Well, what's the risk of this going nuclear?" And some of his advisors would say, "We think the risk is quite high." And others would say, no, that's not a problem because we can deter the Chinese from crossing the nuclear threshold by our own threats to do so, and so on. And so it become one of those, you know, agonizing, complex conversations. And it would actually be a bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think, you know, if you haven't studied that, going back and studying those 13 days and looking at the sorts of choices that Kennedy faced, they would be not dissimilar, not identical, but not dissimilar to some of these choices. And so I think there is a genuine risk that even though the United States can't win that war, I don't think, and even though the risk of it escalating to a nuclear exchange is quite high, a US president might well feel that, exactly for the reasons you say, he has no choice or she has no choice but to push ahead anyway. Those sorts of mistakes are often made. And if you want a really close analogy, look at what happened in 1914. You know, 1939 and 1941 are different in some ways. Interesting story as to why they're different. I won't go into that now. But in 1914, a whole lot of countries ended up going to war. And, you know, the myth is that they didn't know what they were letting themselves in for. The tragedy is they did. They did understand what a terrible war this was going to be. But they just felt they had no choice but to push ahead. And, you know, people draw analogies between 1939 and 1938, the Munich crisis, and 1941 with the choices we face in relation to China and Russia today. But I think it's worth looking at the 1914 analogies as well, because nobody thinks that war was a good idea.
Thank you. Jared just said thank you before I unmuted there. Thank you. I want to welcome an opportunity for one last opportunity for any questions from our folks online, but I know everybody's been listening intently. This has been so great, Hugh. I wish you could join us every week. This is such a great conversation. I'm really grateful. David, thanks for joining. I'm glad you got your question in this really rich conversation. And Professor White, while I have you, I just want to thank you personally for replying to my cold email for comment about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. which is a big part of that. One of our first guests in the series was Daria Ho from Waterloo, University of Waterloo. And she's doing some really exciting work on the history of the South China Sea. I haven't been able to place that article. It may be because it was poorly written, but it also may be because folks don't want to hear that the United Nations has not ratified the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so it can prattle on a lot about China violating that convention, but it in fact has not itself ratified it, which is to me wild, like hair on fire, kind of wild.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the US and China, both have a view of their own primacy in terms of the rules not applying to them.
That's right.
And so I think when we hear from Taiwan with Professor Rigger, and when we hear from Australia, from you, when we hear from these different perspectives, we get such a deeper and a more textured understanding of what the news cycle would have us believe is simply a Beijing-Washington conversation. This has really been such a valuable conversation. I wish we could keep you all of the Australian morning or the California afternoon, but I am going to let you go with great thanks, Professor White. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Thanks, everybody, for joining.